As the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine widens, our hearts continue to go out to the country and its courageous citizenry. Here at the University of South Florida, I want to express our deep support for our Ukrainian students, faculty, and staff. USF is proud to partner with leading experts and organizations to bring to you the latest insights on how the evolving situation in Ukraine impacts the world and you through the Ukraine What's Next series.
Good morning. I'm Casey Welch. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership here at the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus. I want to welcome you to part 3 of our Ukraine What's Next series, focusing on cybersecurity. I want to thank our partners, the West Coast chapter of the Air Force Officers Association, the Global Interdependency Center, Security Management International, the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus, Research One at the University of South Florida, and I want you to please join us for part 4 of our diplomatic and humanitarian aspects on May 24th and let you know of a newly created part 5, Hearts and Minds Exploring Information and Misinformation, on June 8th. We look forward to both of those programs. I want to take this opportunity right now to introduce the Chancellor of the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus, Dr. Karen Holbrook.
Thank you, Casey, and good morning to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Florida, University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus. Some of you may know that we are a consolidated university now. All 3 of our South Florida campuses have come together into one USF. And with that, we can do so many more things and so many larger things for our students, many more classes, many more courses, and many more opportunities. But this is a university that is a global research university. It's a preeminent university in the state. And we are delighted to have the opportunity to put on programs that are meaningful not just to our own campus and to the university, but meaningful to the community. And this one has been an absolute delight as we have worked with General Scott Gray to put this together. This was his idea, and he came forth to tell us what kinds of things we should be thinking about. And as we get together as a group, we keep coming up with more and more opportunities. So we hope this is going to be a good experience for you. We hope you'll come back to the next 2. And we're actually planning on another one that'll happen in the fall with all of our partners that Casey has mentioned. So thank you for being with us today, and please enjoy the conference.
Well, thank you, Dr. Holbrook. I am Major General Scott Gray, Air Force retired, and I am the president of the West Coast chapter of the Florida West Coast chapter of the Air Force Association, and I am delighted to have this partnership going. And I think that we have stumbled onto a really phenomenal sessions of forum here that is going to continue to educate the students and the population of Sarasota County and Florida. We've actually got YouTube videos that are being picked up by numerous folks in various locations throughout the United States that I've been hearing it from. So that's all phenomenal, I think. It's great. Our first session focused mainly on the military aspects of the war in Ukraine. And if you recall, and if you haven't seen it, please go to YouTube and get it. We started off with a phenomenal history of the relationship, very complicated relationship between the Ukraine and the Russians. And it explains an awful lot about where Putin stands and where Zelensky stands. It was a phenomenal basis or foundation for the day. Then we had General Breedlove, a former SAC-EUR, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, talk to us about the military implications. And he had just flown in from NATO headquarters the night before. So his information was very, very relevant, very timely. And he talked about the complexities of trying to help the Ukrainians without crossing a line that would get us to have an Article 5 implementation where Russia attacked a NATO country. He also talked about the potential of NATO expansion with Finland and Sweden. And if you've been watching the papers, some of that has been actually discussed in earnest. He finished up talking about he would not be surprised to see some sort of relationship between the U.S., NATO, and the Ukraine that would look very similar to the FDR-era Lend-Lease. And just yesterday, President Biden signed a Lend-Lease into law. General Deptula partnered with three others on a very, very interesting panel that focused on intel and cyber. And when I say we focused on cyber, it was a scratch the surface. Today we're going to do a deep dive on cyber. But in that, General Deptula stressed that, there really is no difference between an offensive and a defensive weapon. And when he was talking, he said that he would predict that you'd see more powerful and numerous weapons go into the Ukraine that could take out larger targets. And in fact, we've seen Russian ships sunk, and we have seen some activities in Russia that I believe you could probably directly attribute to those new kind of weapons that have been going into the hands of Ukrainian freedom fighters. Our second forum focused on economics, and it was a very, very interesting discussion, I think, on worldwide impacts of this war, what it's done to the oil and gas supplies, to the food supplies. I had no idea that Ukraine supplied 30% of the world's wheat, and we're definitely seeing impacts at our own grocery stores here in the United States on supplies. But think about the worldwide economic impacts and about the food supply impacts that we're witnessing from this very, very small regional war that has got humongous worldwide implications. So those background forums there, if you will, have led up to today's discussion on cyber, and I think you're going to find this to be incredibly informative and prepare us for the diplomatic and humanitarian discussion 2 weeks from now. So sit back and enjoy. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ron Sanders. I'm Staff Director for the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. Let me take a moment to, I guess, correct what Casey Welch said. We too are a sponsor of this conference and event series. I say that with some trepidation because if this doesn't work, we're not going to claim sponsorship, but I'm confident that it will be a great success, and as a result, you should add the Florida Center for Cybersecurity to your list of sponsors and event organizers. With that, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, General Keith Alexander. We have posted General Alexander's extensive bio on the website, but we're very thankful for him to take the time this morning to speak to us. General Alexander has a long and literally storied career in the U.S. military, in the national security world, and in cybersecurity. Most notably, he was a director of the National Security Agency. He began that career as a 3-star and became a 4-star general in the process. He was the first commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and in fact wore not just 2 but 3 hats, NSA, Cyber Command, and something called the National Security Service. And obviously was literally at the tip of the spear when it came to our nation's cybersecurity. He left those posts and founded his own company, something called IronNet. He is the president, the CEO, and founding person. And what he's going to share with us today is a little bit of the insights that he provides to subscribers of IronNet, literally a letter to CEOs that use his services that provides as much inside information and insight as he is allowed to say. So with that, we have General Alexander for about 45 minutes. We're going to let him talk, and then if there's time at the end, questions from the audience are welcome. If you'll hit your Q&A button and send us the questions, I get to interrogate General Alexander like he used to interrogate me. And hopefully we'll gain some further insight as we take this deep dive into cybersecurity. So, General Alexander, thanks again for joining us this morning. Over to you.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm going to start out. I know you've had a lot on Ukraine. It's a very fluid, and I think this is a pivotal moment in history for the United States and for the world, because I think what we're seeing is the formation of a bipolar or a multipolar world. The failures of Russia in this attack on Ukraine is significant to the future, and it's going to have ramifications across not only Europe, but in Asia and the rest of the world. Let me just start out and just quickly go through what's happened and where we are, and then delve into the cyber aspects of that. If you think about February 24th, everybody thought that the Russian forces would take over Ukraine in 72 hours. That's what we thought. That's what NATO thought. That's what Russia thought. What we didn't realize is that Russia hadn't trained for this. They assumed that they would go in and the Ukrainians would welcome them, and it would be a very quick fight. They would get to Kiev and they take over eastern Ukraine, and then they declare victory and put in their own puppet government. They were surprised and stunned that as soon as they crossed the border, the Ukrainians punched them in the nose. And, that's the Mike Tyson approach. And what happened after that, as you can see, they didn't have the training, they didn't have the logistics, and they didn't have a plan. As a consequence, their forces stalled out around Kiev. While they had superior force structure and munitions, they didn't have the will that the Ukrainian forces had. And I think it's important to look at what's happened between 2014 and 2022. In that, I have a sign. I went to Kiev a couple times over the last few years. They had this big sign up. Freedom is our religion. They really believe that. And they worked on it. They fixed their cyber. They worked their military. They trained. They made progress. They didn't get to NATO. They had some issues with corruption and other things that blocked them from getting further in NATO and the EU. But what you can see is this comedian who was the president with a low rating jumped up and said, we're going to defend. And he led the Ukrainians to this victory that they've had so far today. And they've repelled the Russian forces from Western Ukraine. And now the fight is on in the Donbass area. It's important to recognize that as this is going on around the world, remember in the week leading up to this attack, President Putin met with Xi Jinping from China during the Olympics. And I suspect what he said is, we're going to go in. This should be pretty easy. We're going to go in. We'll own Ukraine. We want you as our partners. We're taking some forces off of the border with China. We recognize our future partnership and relationship and ask for your support. And I think Xi Jinping said that this will be good. It'll set the stage for Taiwan. As the Russian forces got bogged down, Putin and his forces punched in the nose. Xi Jinping is looking at that saying, let me get what's happened. NATO has come together. They've hit you with sanctions that's far greater than we ever imagined. They've coalesced a force that we would never have thought possible. And what you've done is not only hurt your chances for taking Ukraine, but you're really impacting our ability. My key goal as the ruler of China is to bring back Taiwan. That's now going away. And so you see China stepping back. And as this is going on, about 6 weeks ago, China instead moved forces into the South China Sea. And as they did that, they militarized 3 islands. There's a lot of tension going on. And you're seeing that play out. But China and Xi Jinping has essentially stood on the sidelines. So if we go back to now to Ukraine, what's going on is Putin was working for a victory. He had to have a victory before the speech he made yesterday. He didn't have it. He's lost 12 general officers. He's lost the ship that they talk about the most, the Moscow. And that ship, when you think about it, was the biggest ship they had in the Black Sea. It was sunk by Ukrainian missiles off from shore. And now there is intel out there and word out there that the United States at least provided some insights that was the Moscow and also insights on some of the attacks on us. So Putin had a couple choices as he was going into this speech yesterday. We thought he would declare war because he needs to actually mobilize more forces if he's going to be successful in the eastern part of Ukraine. He doesn't have the force structure. I don't think he has the equipment. He doesn't have the leadership. They haven't fought in this area. It's going to get muddy. And I think the Ukrainians, they're not going to give up. This is their land. I think President Zelensky, he said, this is ours. They're going to fight for it. And they're getting the weapons and the capabilities from NATO and the United States, and it's increasing. You'll see that in the papers today. And so this is going to be a longer fight. And what Putin has to think about as he's going through this, he recognizes that if this isn't successful, it most likely ends in his removal from office, potential coup with his assassination, or coup with him being turned over to the International Criminal Court. So one of the papers said yesterday, he looks besieged. I think he's not only besieged, he's worried. What can he do to eke out a win, and how can he help show that this was the right thing to do? There's fractures within Russia. You see it going on. You see the attack on the intel community, the arrest of key players. You see the military starting to actually question what he's doing. And you see a number of people going to CIA and to the news saying they disagree inside Russia. The rationale for him for declaring war and mobilizing his troops means he could have cracked down. Because he didn't do that, I think it also says he's in a weakened position. He didn't have the support to do that. And I think what he's trying to do is to explain in his speech. If you listen to the speech he gave yesterday, it was more, why did we go in? We had to go in, denazify. They were right on our border. We're taking care of what our future is. We had to do this. And I think people realize we didn't have to do this. You wanted this as a quick win and you failed. And we've lost 20,000 plus people. And how is the rest of the world looking at this? And the sanctions. The sanctions are having a devastating impact on Russia. There's so much he can do, only so much that he can do to prop them up. But it was said 6 weeks ago that two countries are being destroyed, Ukraine and Russia. And now the oligarchs, the military, and the intelligence community within Russia recognize this is going bad. We're going to be a decade plus digging out from this. And we've got to figure out how do we get the right relationship with Europe. And while this is all going on, one of the things that everybody expected was a major cyber conflict. And what is invisible to most people is the fact that there is a cyber conflict going on. And that cyber conflict has actually started out with over 3,000 attacks by Russia on Ukraine. So Russia focused their cyber teams on going after Ukrainian government, military, and those who were supporting the war. You can see that in Poland and elsewhere. And then it quickly focused to support their campaign. They've used 8 different types of wiper viruses with some effect. The thing that they didn't build into their calculus in these attacks was the improvement in their IT hygiene and their cyber defenses. Ukraine has done a lot of work with the West. You look at companies that are in there, not just ours, my own, but you have Mandiant, you have Microsoft, you have Palo Alto, you have all the US and European countries in there helping them repair, build it back, and keep on going. Russia thought they didn't have any of that. They were surprised. I think one of the things that worries me now is, so what is he going to do? What's the path forward? So if you think about this, you've got three sets of things that he has to think about. His relationship with China. I think this is significantly impacted. I think Xi Jinping is looking at him in my terms, thinking this guy's an idiot. Partnering with him is like taking an anchor. I don't want that. I've got to figure out how to distance him off the table. And while I go after the South China Seas and try to get as much out of this as I can. And oh, by the way, the United States and other countries are pushing back in the South China Sea. I think it's also important to recognize that while this is going on, China continues to steal intellectual property, the greatest transfer of wealth in history. It will be over $500 billion this year, more than we'll spend on the support of the war in Ukraine. Will lose in intellectual property theft by China. So that's going on. So watch that as the bigger long-term existential threat to our country. Going back to Putin. So what's he do? I think he's going to continue to push in eastern Ukraine, try to push as much force, pull more folks off of the border with China, push more forces in there, and try to eke out a win, try to claim the Donetsk and Luhansk areas and call that the Donbass region and claim that as Russia's. He would like to have a land bridge from Russia all the way to Crimea in the Black Sea. I don't think he'll get that. And you can see in the papers today, he's bombing Odessa to try to pin down Ukrainian forces there while he tries to eke out the win in the Donetsk and the Luhansk area. And what I think has surprised him is where he thought all these Ukrainian people, they fought with us, in his mind, they fought with us in World War II. This was the big battle where most of the fighting occurred in the Ukraine, Belarus area. We were friends and partners then. What's happened? And I think there might have been friends, but the Ukrainians didn't want to be ruled by Russia. They wanted their own country. Freedom is their religion. And so he's got a couple of things left he can do. It's interesting that the rhetoric on nuclear weapons has gone away over the last 2 weeks. I suspect that someone told him, you use nuclear weapons and you're gone. They're not going to handle it. Now, I say that. You never know how this will go. He can launch tactical nuclear weapons to make a statement. One issue and course of action that we looked at from a tactical perspective was to use a nuclear weapon on an area in Ukraine and then threaten NATO with nuclear weapons if they didn't help get a ceasefire and give Russia parts of Ukraine. That's one opportunity, course of action he could take. But I think that's been taken off the table because you see the news in Russia, they're no longer talking about nuclear weapons. They're saying, no, we would not use nuclear weapons. We can beat them conventionally. Fact is, I don't think they can beat them conventionally. I actually believe that Ukraine will win the conventional war. So now you've got chemical. I thought he would use chemical to root out the last fighters in the Azov steel plant. He didn't, but he could still. And the third is cyber. He does have forces and capabilities to actually use cyber in a much more coherent way than he has in the past. And if you think about cyber, what I believe he's failed to do in all his planning is to actually come up with a campaign plan for what they're going to do. And this significant failure in planning, and I'm sure General Breedlove talked about some of this. But if you think about what's the campaign look like, what are the various courses of action that we have, who's leading it, and what are we doing? That type of planning has to exist in cyber as well. My assessment, he doesn't have a campaign plan. As a consequence, the fight that's going on in cyber right now is blocking most of it. I don't have access to the classified stuff, so I can talk about this and give you my thoughts. But I suspect that the United States and Europe are clearly pushing back. You know, it is now the mantra of US Cyber Command to defend forward. And so when Russia, SVR, GRU, and FSB try to attack into Ukraine and potentially NATO and the United States, they're getting blocked. Their offensive forces, I believe, are being stymied by not just ours, but other countries. And you see hackers like Anonymous and others coming in to fight. It's interesting to note that in this battle in cyber, the hackers are playing a much more visible role, and they're taking credit for it. In my opinion, that's probably not as helpful as people would think. And the reason is we would go in with a plan, and if a hacker unit came in and knocked down part of the web, that might have been the access we had to go make a military capable cyber attack happen. And when you think about that, that's the bad part about having hackers just come in and start doing stuff that muddies the water and makes it more difficult to accomplish clear tactical and strategic objectives. What am I worried about? So let's look at what could happen and where the biggest issues are for our country in cyber. The first thing that we have in cyber, when you look at it, is every company defends itself. Think about that. If you think about every company and every government agency has its own defense. And what they're doing is they're defending as if they're one entity, and then they share what they know when they know it. The problem with that is by the time they know it, it's normally 30 days later. If you look at SolarWinds, which was the SVR campaign, one of the things that happened in that campaign is they were going after government departments, but they impacted 18,000 companies. Imagine if they did a supply chain attack like that with our current defenses and used a wiper virus. That would be devastating. We're not prepared for that. We have to start working together in cyber. I think what the director of national cyber, Chris English, talks about is to beat one of us, you got to beat all of us. But in order to do that, we've got to work together. So I think what we're going to learn in this combat situation with Russia and Ukraine is we've got to come together collectively in cyber, because China has almost an order of magnitude more forces in cyber than Russia. They might not be as capable as the SVR, but the Ministry of State Security is really good. And when you think about that, their ability to impact our US internal critical infrastructure and government is huge. If we're going to defend against that, we've got to learn to work together, the public and private sector. We can talk more about that. But so here's what I think is going to happen over the next week. And it's going to play out in one of two ways. Does he get out of this with his life and still in charge? Or does someone in Russia conduct a coup and remove him from office? In order for him to stay in charge, he's got to make some things happen in eastern Ukraine. I think they're going to slog it out for a while. I think that will take this decision cycle. While it could happen at any point, think of it as tension on a bar that could just snap. But I think it'll go on for a while, that battle in eastern Ukraine, with a lot of deaths of Russian soldiers. I suspect that the numbers are in the neighborhood of 30,000 killed already. And when you think about that, they're saying something like 1,500. They're off by a factor of 20. When that word gets back to the Russian people, the fact that they started this, that Putin led them into this, they've lost all their equipment and they are losing all their people. They lost their flagship. They're losing tanks and other things. And they have sanctions and they can't rebuild. Russia is in a much worse situation than they were before. And economically, I believe it'll take them more than a decade to dig out from where they are. Unless somebody comes in, takes out Putin, hands him over to the International Criminal Court, or perhaps buries him, and goes back to Europe and says, this was his fault, we didn't agree with it, and we'll make it right. We want to partner with you. That's the only way I can see them getting out of this. So, Ron, I see you're back on, so you must have some questions from the students. Go ahead, and the other people.
I've got lots of questions from students and myself. Thanks again. Those are very insightful remarks, General. And I'm going to exercise executive privilege and ask you the first question. And it's a four-parter. So, but they all have the same sort of vector. Let's put you back in uniform. I see you've got some memorabilia behind you there. Let's have you put that fancy hat back on and those 4 stars. Could you talk a little bit about the lessons that the Russian invasion of Ukraine have provided in cybersecurity and maybe more broadly cyberspace? First for NATO and primarily the European Union, but let's define it as NATO. That's part 1. Part 2 for the U.S. and in particular U.S. policymakers, the Biden administration. His Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. What lessons does the Ukraine invasion provide, again, in cyberspace for U.S. policymakers? Third part, and I'm going to use up all your time. Third part, what lessons has the U.S. military learned? You alluded to that earlier. Campaign plans, capabilities, cyber as a part of kinetic action. Or separately. So what lessons have the U.S. military learned? And you used to be in uniform, so probably you're a very astute observer of that. And then lastly, although our panel will cover this in greater detail, lastly, what can U.S. citizens learn from this? Of course, the president has issued his warning to U.S. businesses. If it were me, I would have issued a warning to U.S. citizens as well. What can you and I do as private citizens to protect ourselves? What have we learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So again, 4 parts. Your king for the day, or supreme allied commander, or something. What lessons learned for NATO? What lessons learned for U.S. policymakers? What lessons learned for U.S. military? And finally, what lessons have we learned ourselves?
Yeah, so I had to write those down because remember, I'm an Army guy. I can get 2 of 4, but not 4 of 4. So let me start with the major lesson learned. Cyber is an element of national power. And what they're doing, they're using cyber to actually help the tactical and strategic operations on the ground. So what they're doing is they're using cyber to go after critical infrastructure, to go after the military, to go after command posts, to do that. Cyber is an integral part of what we will fight, the way we'll fight in the future. And so one of the things that we actually did is we created national mission teams to focus on key areas around the globe to support the combatant commands. But in this case, one of the things that we wrestled with the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commanders is a fight in Europe doesn't take place just in Europe. It's a global fight because cyber is global. It also brings to mind for NATO, and it's interesting, some of my friends now are in charge of NATO, and I'm sure General Breedlove knows them too. When you think about Stu Peach, who is now the military commander for NATO, you've got his, I think what he should be doing is looking at their war plans for defending against Russia and saying, how are we integrating in cyber into that? And when you look at it, the biggest failure that we have is every country defends itself. There is no real-time sharing. I'll call that a radar view of cyber so that you can see an attack coming in and help defend it. We do it for missile defense because missiles are fast. We should do it for cyber because cyber is faster. So we have to have that kind of view of NATO. Interestingly, that's what our company stood up to do. It would be the same thing for US policymakers. You see, when we look at our country, we have been blessed by the fact that we have two oceans to block attacks on us physically from other countries. They can throw missiles at us. We got missile defense. They can throw cyber at us. Oops, we're not ready for cyber in a way that we should be. That public-private partnership, the partnership between the government and the private sector has to be fixed. We have to practice it. We have to train it because it is our infrastructure that the adversary is going to go after. Steal our intellectual property, shut down our ability to communicate, destroy our will to fight. That'll happen. And so the U.S. policymakers have to do that. Part of that is the U.S. military. You know, I had a great career. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. You know, I was, as you know, Ron, I had a lot of fun and would joke every once in a while. Having said that, I was on the 1st Desert Storm as the G2 for 1st Armored Division, and in the planning process, helping to plan not only what 1st Armored Division would do and how we'd fight, but how 7th Corps and eventually how the U.S. forces would fight against Iraq, the left hook. Doing things like that gave us the opportunity to think, okay, you now have a military tactical, operational, and strategic plan. Now, if you step back and say, okay, now we've got cyber, everything went digital in 2007 when everything started to shift from analog to digital. We're now completely digital. Overlay on that, the digital fight. And so that has to be part of the planning. Now, if you think about US citizens and US companies, we don't understand how bad can be. I think, you know, the nice part about where we live and what we do, you know, we step back and you look out. We're in Florida, sunny, it's great. You think, wow, this is really nice. What we don't realize is it's really nice because we're fortunate. But somebody could go after water, oil and gas, the pipelines, all these things. And as you mentioned, the president saw that they were doing plans to attack the pipelines and some of the other capabilities that we have. And they warned the U.S. that, and some of our industry, heads up, they're planning attacks. I suspect our offensive forces help block parts of those. That's a great win, but they won't always be able to block them. And we're at a point now where you've got to step back and say, okay, if you can't block them, we have to partner together, create that virtual radar picture. And that picture has to be created between the private sector and the public sector so that one attack on one company can be automatically shared with other companies and can be anonymously shared with the government so they know where the attacks are going. That's the future of cyber. That's where this is going to go. I am firmly convinced that if we don't do that, we will lose in a combat situation with China because they have the overwhelming force to hurt us in this area. So we have to create a technical radar view-like situation to protect our infrastructure as a priority for our country. It is that important. And, oh, by the way, we should stop the theft of intellectual property. That theft, if you look at the last 15 years, is over $7.5 trillion. Think about that. We've lost over $7.5 trillion because we've not been able to defend against Chinese theft of intellectual property. So
I think that's, you know, sort of the boon and the bane of our existence, right? We are so decentralized that it's difficult to attack us as a country. On the other hand, if we don't stand together as a country, we leave ourselves more vulnerable.
right.
Let me just add, General, a quick plug for Cyber Florida. One of the things that the state legislature has asked us to do, and I'll caveat this by saying the governor has not yet signed the budget, but that budget does commission Cyber Florida to conduct a cybersecurity risk assessment for all of Florida's critical infrastructure. Local government, hospitals, financial services, water treatment plants, electrical power grid, etc. So we're currently devising a strategy to do that. It's got a short fuse, but with that in hand, our hope is that the state government, if not the federal, can start taking action to build stronger cyber defenses. But there is a question in all that for you, General, so I'm getting to that and noting that we don't have a whole lot more time for you. One of the issues with cybersecurity, of course, is that it is so asymmetric. It doesn't take massive forces, missiles, missile silos, nuclear weapons plants, etc., to conduct a devastating cyber attack. So it's asymmetric, and it's also very unpredictable and uncontrollable. You touched on this. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of non-state actors, proxies and otherwise, criminal organizations and organizations that may just want to play with this, like Anonymous, for and against Russia attacking the West attacking Russia? Could you talk a little bit more about how that plays into our military and national security doctrine?
Sure, and going down to a more tactical level in this discussion, if you think about what's going on right now, what we're seeing is state on state, and we're talking about a strategic level between the U.S., NATO, and Russia on Ukraine, with us probably blocking stuff trying to get to the U.S. and NATO from Russia. What does Russia use to do that? First, think about Russia. A number of the key ransomware groups are in Russia. Think of Arivo, Conti, all these ones that have had attacks, what they did on the Colonial Pipeline. That still exists. And it is my belief that Russia, Putin, the FSB and the SVR control what they can and cannot do. And today they're using those more to focus on Ukraine than on the US, but they can switch that back. I suspect what they would do, if you recall in 2017, the GRU attacked the Ukrainian tax office with destructive malware. They made a mistake because that destructive malware got out and destroyed Maersk, FedEx, and a number of big companies, caused tens of billions of dollars in damage. And the GRU officers that did that were indicted by the FBI. The Solar Winds campaign, I believe, was conducted by the SVR to figure out where those indictments would go. And so you have GRU conducting ransomware-like attacks using NotPetya, a wiper virus with no key. You have all these hacker groups within Russia that I believe Russian authorities have a leash on. In 2007, they used those hacker groups to go after Estonia and shut down and try to hurt Estonia with just distributed denial of service attacks. In 2008, they used some of those groups and others to attack the government, financial sector, energy sector of Georgia as part of their military campaign. And today, my biggest concern is if he turns and says to these folks, let's make the United States feel some pain, they're going to attempt to get in and use wiper viruses without a key, ransomware-like capabilities without keys against energy, oil and gas, finance, government sector, and state level. I think they will. I think that's one of the things that we have to be concerned about that they would do. I liken that to carpet bombing because I don't think they have a campaign plan. They haven't taken the time to put that together and employ those forces in a more coherent manner. And I say that because I look at what they did in Solar Marker, what they did in Solar Wind, and what they've done in other campaigns. They kind of post something and say, hey, free targets go after these things. I think we'll see something like that. I'm concerned about that. We're not prepared for that. So in that regard, I think the biggest thing that we have to do is say, okay, so how do you stop ransomware? And if you think about what's happening right now, some of those are coming from Russia, but there are other folks that use ransomware, North Korea, Iran, all these others are going after, and China. China's effect is to steal intellectual property, not to get money. They don't need the money. But North Korea, Iran, Russia needs money. So they're using ransomware. And I would speculate that those ransomware groups are paying some back to the Russian government or somebody in the Russian government. So you're seeing that. And I think that's going to be part of the future. And so from, if you were to ask me what I'm concerned about, we're not ready for that type of attack where somebody just starts throwing stuff at us and hoping just to cause us pain. Look at the amount of damage the 2017 attack did. It's huge, tens of billions of dollars. That would hit NATO. That would hit the US. I suspect we're going to see things like that. And so what our forces, these, I like the way, and I think we're very fortunate that have stood up Cyber Command. In fact, Admiral Mike McConnell was one of the key leaders in helping to do that. When you think about this and how we're going forward, you have a coherent planning capability to look at how you defend the country. And they're looking at that. So you brought up the last question in your part. What do we do to help? We got to push for collective defense, that public-private partnership. Everybody. So I'll pause there.
Let me just hijack this. First, a plug. General, you mentioned Mike McConnell. He is the executive director of Cyber Florida. He couldn't be with us today, but he and General Alexander were both key players in, frankly, bringing this critical challenge to the attention of the nation, in particular the nation's chief policymakers like POTUS. I'm going to hijack this real quick, General, because one of the things that the state legislature has also done is place, and again, this is a bill on the governor's desk, and we're assuming he's going to sign it. We've become the second state in the nation, as best we can tell, and in fact the largest state of the nation that has placed an outright ban on ransomware payments, at least on state agencies and local governments. Your thoughts on an outright ban? Is that something that should be done state by state? Is it ineffective, or is that a potential for national policy?
That's a tough issue, and I'll tell you why. When you look at the Colonial Pipeline, the issue is, do you pay it or not? Now, in reality, as it turned out, just rebuilding their system was faster than paying and getting the ransomware. Although they paid it, they could have done it either way. So I think my intuition is to not pay, but you've got to be able to rebuild, and critical infrastructure is the key. My concern for what we're talking about here is the attackers aren't going to have a key. They want you to scramble around thinking you're going to pay. They'd actually like you to pay and then tell you too bad. Didn't work. And you're toast. And so that's the military objective, is to hurt our country. And so I think not paying makes sense in some cases. I think there has to be an exception, and this may be where the government and private industry get together and say, what's the right thing to do given this situation? If you have it, if you have it in such a way that you can't dig back out of it, I can't think of one right now where I would pay, but there may be some in the healthcare and other areas that you might need to pay. Having said that, I think we need to push back on ransomware. I like the idea of going after them in a more coherent manner. Treat them as the pirates of the Barbary Coast, where we use the military to go.
Analogy,
Yeah. And use the Cyber Command, the intel agencies in the US and NATO and other parts of the world to go after these guys in a coherent manner. When they come up, hammer them, take their money, shut down their network, and then indict them. I think that's what we need to do, be offensive in this capability.
General, let me depart from our focus on Ukraine and Russia and ask you to talk a little bit more about China. First, do you think our economies are so now intertwined that we would never see the sort of "let's just hurt them" campaign from China, or are we still vulnerable to that with the idea that maybe China can withstand, a U.S. recession or depression that would affect their own industrial capability?
I think this is where Xi Jinping has to be looking at what is going on in Russia and with Europe. The coalition that's been brought together has to be a great concern to him. And as more countries are willing to work together, I mentioned early on, you see the evolution of potentially a bipolar or multipolar world, where you have the democratic states and maybe some of the autocratic states. You have the China and China related states and Russia and what's ever left there kind of working together. In this case, China, their goal, they want to build their economy. So the theft of intellectual property is going to be their first and major approach. They want the South China Sea for the oil and the resources there. And they want Taiwan. And they want to be recognized as a world power. So all of that comes into tension with the US. You know, it's interesting. I think everybody who's been in the Pacific sees what's going on with respect to China. And they're going to keep pushing, but they're a big country. And so that's where I come back. They are stealing our intellectual property. You know, you look at the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35.
Yeah.
Their version looked exactly like ours. No, that's not. You know,
what a surprise, huh?
Yeah, it's not like everybody went to aeronautical engineering and came up with the same design in class. They stole it, and they stole a lot more. And so if we want to get out in front of that, we have to fix the theft of intellectual property. With the defense industrial base, we have to fix it with the large technology firms, and we have to work together, and we have to shut it down. That's a government, private sector partnership that has to occur. We have to get there. I do think that China right now sees the opportunity, with everybody focused on Ukraine, to steal the South China Sea, and they're doing that. That's the militarization. If you look that up, just Google South China Sea news, you'll see this is really a battle that's ongoing. It's not in the papers because everybody's focused on Ukraine. Look at what Ecolino and the PACOM team is fighting with right now. And folks from, Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines and other countries, Vietnam, they're saying, hold it, these guys are taking over. This is owned by 7 countries, not the US, but 7 countries. And China's just usurping their authority and saying, it's ours. Put down that, we build an island, we'll militarize it. And if you want to take it, you have to beat us. I think that is potentially one of the most dangerous areas for our future. How do you not have a confrontation with China like we have with Russia over Taiwan, over the South China Sea? And I believe right now, Xi Jinping sees the coalition coming together. If we can do that on China, we can stop them because it will hurt them economically. And his first priority is to grow the economy of China, to support their growth. If he can't do that, if we conduct sanctions against China like we did Russia, that would be a whole different ballgame.
Right.
And so I think he's got to be worried about that. And so he'll do everything up until the thing and then draw back a little bit. Everything up to the thing and draw back. Steal what he can and draw back. And you might recall when we were on active duty, we pushed back on his theft of intellectual property in the defense industrial base, President Obama. And then he said, yep, we stop. Oh,
Yeah.
those guys stopped. These other guys, we didn't know you meant all of them. And so they're all over it, and they are attacking and stealing like crazy.
General, look, let me put in a plug for that broader issue. Let's not have all of our attention soaked up by Russia and Ukraine. There are other battlegrounds, particularly in cyberspace, occurring as we speak. I don't want to steal any of President Law's thunder, but we're in the process of establishing a new institute on global and national security. And I think we're going to be able to get a colleague of yours, General Frank McKenzie, who used to be, up until just a few weeks ago, commander of U.S. Central Command, and who's quite an intellectual on national security matters. And I think we're going to get him to run it. So more on that, and I hope we can engage you in this as well. I have to tell you, General, I really, really appreciate you taking the time this morning. You've given us a lot of insight, a lot to talk about. I'm on the panel that follows, and you've given us some great food for thought. So thank you again for your time, and frankly for your service to this country, both in uniform and now not.
Well, thanks, Ron. An honor to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So General Gray, let me turn it back over to you and for the rest of the program.
The fact that Cyber Command is up is obviously beneficial to the United States, and you really drove that home, General Alexander, so thank you so much. And Ron Sanders, thank you. You did a great job of moderating that and handling the questions that came in. Tremendous insight and a great way to start our cybersecurity day. At this time, we're going to move into a panel, and let's see if we can get the panelists up, and I'll try and introduce them for us. Okay, our first panelist is Chuck Brooks from Cybersecurity Evangelist. Appreciate you joining in, Chuck. Then we have Serge Jorgensen, again, who's a founding partner and Chief Technology Officer for Silent. So Serge, thank you. And then we have Elzar Camper from Solutions and Practices Director, Pivot Point Security. Elzar, thank you for joining us. Appreciate that. And once again, Mr. Ron Sanders, who's a staff director of Cyber Florida. So to all four of you, thank you so much. We appreciate it. I'd like to offer each of you a chance for opening comments in response to what General Alexander just said. So Chuck, I'd like to start with you, please.
Yeah, I concur 100% with the General's observations. It's an interesting scenario we're now in. I have to start off by saying that there's been a lot of warnings about attacks coming to the United States, particularly to infrastructure and business. And there's a lot of probably geopolitical factors that are intervening. And I'll get to those a little later. But I think the fact is that we need to be vehemently prepared for any kind of situation. And I think the benefit of having this awareness now and all this alertness coming from the intelligence community, from the DHS, and even from the Five Eyes, is that it has caused us to look at our own internal operations. And the fact is, despite the Ukrainian conflict, what's going on, most companies are vulnerable anyway. And they're vulnerable to criminal hackers more often than not. And phishing is still the main way in. So anything we can do to fortify our defenses and be more prepared is a good thing. And, we have to look in the long run, and cybersecurity and cyber warfare, as it's been experienced in Ukraine, and is something we're going to have to deal with much more seriously, both from the government side and from the private sector side.
Yeah, he drove home the point of how we're so independent. Our businesses are protecting themselves, but maybe it's time to start coalescing as a country to offer better defense. I thought that was a real interesting take on the whole thing there.
And we're seeing a lot more of that now with CISA pushing the public-private sector cooperation, particularly with critical infrastructure.
Okay, great, thanks. Serge, your thoughts?
That was really interesting. You touched on two areas that frequently get lost. One is that hearts and minds and disinformation. And I think it's important to just keep bubbling that up and keeping that on our radars as we do talk about the more destructive ransomware, wiping attacks and things like that. Because it's certainly something that the Russians have always been really good at. And there's some questions on the U.S. side of things of, is that something that we should get better at? And what do we think about distributing information and trying to counter the disinformation activities? And then also the theft of intellectual property. And I think General Alexander really touched on that, but it does frequently get lost in that the Chinese, at the end of the day, just stealing trillions of dollars worth of intellectual property and managing to keep up with our advances and forcing us to redevelop things that we wouldn't necessarily have to if we hadn't had an intellectual property theft. So I think those are two really important areas that General Alexander touched on, but it does get lost. So I just wanted to bubble those back up.
Yeah, the 2 points you brought up are really critical. I think that disinformation, and did that or did not it influence this election, or could it impact future elections, is one aspect of the disinformation campaign. And then the intellectual property side, I had absolutely no idea how large the theft was. I knew it was going on, but he just stunned me when he said the amounts of capital that was walking out the door, if you would. So really good observation there. Okay, Elzar, your thoughts?
Yeah, to the general's points, I mean, the idea of the warnings, I think, need to be heeded by the private sector, right? Of what are these smaller and medium-sized businesses really doing to combat this issue? And the concern that I really have is the ability, the how. We hear the threats, we hear the information coming out of the government. We hear about the extended cooperation between the government and the private sector, but I'm really concerned about the tactical side of how organizations are really going to prepare themselves to be proactive, to make sure they have the appropriate information security strategy, the right controls in place, and then to Serge's point, the misinformation, disinformation, big problem. And I think those are great points that he's brought up, and looking forward to really getting into the how today, and then really kind of giving that guidance to talk about what we can do, I think, as a nation and as a private sector to move things forward.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that we as private citizens are going to have to start thinking about this more also, and he sort of hammered that home. Small businesses, private citizens, we're going to be out there sooner than later, I fear. Mr. Sanders, you did a great job moderating. Any other thoughts?
Two quick ones, and that may set the stage for at least some of our discussion. I think talking about limiting China's access to the U.S.'s intellectual property is far easier said than done. There are many folks, many scientists, many engineers, many business people who will say that our society's openness is one of the reasons we lead the world in innovation. And so we have to balance that openness, that freedom, and that innovation with cybersecurity. Not an easy balance. I hope it can be achieved, but not an easy balance. Secondly, Scott, I do think that what General Alexander highlighted is that we have more questions than answers. And the good news for us, and us here includes the University of South Florida as well as the panelists, is that there's a lot of work to do when it comes to policy. There's a lot of work to do when it comes to executing that policy, but right now we have neither, and we need to spend some time thinking about what sort of military doctrine, civil doctrine, what do we need? Where do we draw the line? And that line is pretty blurry. So I think those are all things that we can take as food for thought. And again, I'll put in a plug for not only USF Sarasota Manatee and events like this, but for General McKenzie and the new USF Institute for Global and National Security. These are precisely the kinds of questions we should be attempting to answer, and frankly, that's going to take some thought.
Well, that's going to take a fundamental shift, I think, in education also, where we start training our students to not just get involved with STEM, but also start thinking about intel and cyber as they go through their classwork. But I want to use your comment sort of as a segue, and this is something I would have liked to have asked the general himself. But when we think about our alliances, and specifically we're concerned with NATO right now, do we have inside the Nato Alliance, and I don't know if any of you can speak directly to this or not, but inside the Nato Alliance, do we have defensive agreements and offensive agreements, the way we're going to use cyber inside of that alliance and in other alliances? And if not, is this somewhere that we're going to have to migrate to?
I can answer that quickly. Yes, we do, but they're in the nascent stages, and you're seeing some of that already between coordination. A lot of this has happened over the last decade. It's happened mostly through DoD, but also coordination through some of the civilian agencies. And it's helped. If you look at what's happened now in the Ukrainian conflict, you can actually say that some of the assistance given to Ukraine in the last few years has really bolstered their cyber security capabilities to help with the onslaught from the Russians, who they thought they'd run right over them. So it
Right.
does work. And I saw today we're just opening up a special relationship with Lithuania too in that regard. So the answer is yes. A lot of this is not publicized big in the media because they're bilateral agreements, and they're also NATO agreements
Right.
that are very sensitive.
Because
Let me leap in here and just underscore what Chuck said and offer some good news and bad news. The good news is that those relationships exist, and they are following pretty much the same protocols we use in the sharing of intelligence. There's the 5 Eyes. I don't know if everyone in the audience understands that reference. I think General Alexander made it. But it's the basically five Western-speaking democracies, US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. And we share Tier 1 intelligence with them. And I think as a consequence, we have Tier 1 cybersecurity arrangements, defensive and offensive arrangements with them. Other European Union countries are Tier 2, Germany, France, for example. We don't, to be candid, we don't share everything with them. And I think that applies not only to intelligence, but cybersecurity. That's the good news is, so sharing is going on. The bad news is, personally, I'm not sure that the intelligence sharing protocols are as transferable to cybersecurity as they could be.
Yeah.
Because of that blurry line between military, public policy, and private economy. And because of that blurry line, I don't think the intelligence sharing protocols are as robust as, frankly, the world requires.
There's no doubt about that. You know, when you build your campaigns, you'll start with individual services, and then you'll end up with a joint theater campaign, if you would. Then now we're laying space and cyber on top of those. So if we're going to be truly joint and truly less vulnerable and more offensive, you've got to incorporate cyber at the very beginning. And I hope that's what's being done with all of our international treaties and campaigns and everything. So, but following up on that, is it time for there to be a treaty? I'm going to say Geneva Convention, okay? But do we need a treaty that defines what is a fair target or an off-limits target for cyber?
I'd be happy to say that, to intervene. I mean, to talk about this.
Okay.
There is talk of treaties and activities that really, it could be a blurry area, though. What constitutes a cyber attack? I mean, is it, nation attribution is really difficult sometimes. They use cutouts. Even Russia, has a group of, the Fancy Bear, AP-28, and a few other groups that are semi-independent, not quite independent. So, and then also there's false flags. There's a lot of nations around taking advantage of the Ukraine conflict by adding to it and using it, like Iran, like China, Belarus, others. So it's very difficult to sometimes draw the same lines as a kinetic treaty as you would a cyber treaty. Having said that, there are issues, though. As General Alexander put out, said, the theft of IP, is that an act of war? Now, the Chinese built a whole hypersonic program based on theft from our secure resources. What do we determine as really vital resources and what is considered an attack in a country? So I think the answer is yes, we need to define those because we're moving to a digital age, but we have to be very precise because you could say there's an act of war every day with what's happening with cyber.
Yeah.
It is. Go ahead, Elsa.
Serge, go ahead.
Elsa, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say to the point too of like the definition of cyber attack, right? Is when do you actually cross that line? Is it considered, recon of a system? Is it considered the actual exploitation of a system or the exfiltration of information? And I think that would be extremely difficult to look at and say, okay, if someone is just scanning a box or they're actually doing the exploitation, when do you cross that line to say this was an actual attack? So I think that's just the one thing that would be harder to define. That's really what I want to say there. Go ahead, Serge.
And yeah, thanks. I was just going to add that the Russians started drawing some of those lines. It was really interesting, where the head of the Russian space agency said that he was warning that cyber attacks against satellites would be a justification for war. And so he was obviously trying to draw a line there of saying, hey, if you start taking out satellites, which through cyber would be the obvious way to do that, because it's a lot of downsides to blowing satellites up, and it's very obvious, as opposed to a satellite just suddenly going offline and you're not able to talk to it anymore. But interestingly, that clearly doesn't apply to ground-based services, the ground side of the satellite uplinks, like we saw with acid rain and the supposed Russian attack against Viasat at the outbreak of the war and taking out the 30,000, I think it was, Viasat modems to try to break up communication. So there are people that are feeling out those lines a little bit. I think potentially we may see some red lines come out of this of what is legit, what would be crossing that line. But to Elzar's point, that's going to be really tough. The false flag, the operations, well, I didn't mean to, or like the Chinese have done for years of, okay, well, it was a bunch of university kids and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Well, let me make it even harder, Serge and Elzar. To me, there's also a question of sovereignty. One nation's cyber espionage, a legitimate act, lots of people have said, we engage in cyber espionage just as our adversaries do. That's sort of accepted. When does that spill over and become something else? Theft of IP, or maybe even more draconian, cyber sabotage. Prepping the battlefield is, our Russian intrusions into our electrical power grid for the sole purpose of interrupting that power grid. Is that espionage or is that sabotage? I will say this though. My personal view is that you will never see the U.S. sign a treaty that impedes its sovereign ability to undertake cyber espionage. We don't engage in industrial espionage and economic espionage, at least not that we know of, but I'm sure many of our companies do. We know some countries do as well, France, Germany, etc. So frankly, I think the prospects for a treaty that governs cyberspace will be limited by questions of national sovereignty, because what's good for the goose may not be good for the gander.
Yeah. And, as we've entered into this information age, the lines get blurred real quick, as you all have pointed out. When you stop and think about the way that the Russians are prosecuting this war, it's sort of like Sherman going towards Atlanta. It's just destroy, slash and burn, and move on. And think back to how the U.S. has prosecuted this war, is trying to use pinpoint precision strikes, okay? Now, so we put schools, hospitals, anything with the Red Cross, that's off limits. Russians don't care. They just want to destroy it and move on. So if you apply those principles to an actual war, all right, can you target specific things such as a nuclear power plant and take it down using cyber? But what would happen if you were to cause a leak and have a radiation leak? You've now crossed the line into weapons of mass destruction. So it's some very, very interesting things, some very tough decisions that are going to have to be made downstream. A broad brush attack against a utility supply might be totally different than it's something against a pinpoint location such as a nuclear power generator. And then,
Just real, sorry, I mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Go, Elzar, please.
No, I was just going to say too, and something that Serge said when he said we didn't mean to, which I think it's extremely interesting when you look at the critical infrastructure and you look at the older SCADA systems and these energy management systems that are extremely old. That's something that's very benign, of like a recon scan or something that's just a probing type of activity could drop a system that could lead to something like an outage in a critical infrastructure or energy sector. So it's very interesting when you think of what can happen by accident just because of older technology in certain infrastructures.
Yeah, unintended consequence. All right. So I want to back up for a moment. All right. And I probably should have started here, but Ron, your question just led right into the treaty discussion there. So what kind of cyber attacks are there? What are the differences between nation state attacks, proxy attacks, and affiliated organized crime attacks? Chuck, I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, really, it's very cloudy, because most of the attacks, particularly initiated from Russia, are affiliated attacks or organized, groups, as I mentioned, like AP-28, Fancy Bear, Cold Driver, Turkey. They use them all the time. Now they're also GRU sits on those boards, and sometimes they're used for geopolitical purposes by the Russians. But for the most part, they're criminal enterprises. They extort. They use ransomware attacks primarily, and they're building their own banks with this ransomware money. But they've also been very effective in targeting critical infrastructure, as you it has not been totally attributed to them, but the SolarWinds attack, they were sitting in our system for over a year without us detecting it. So it's important to know that they have capabilities. And that's another thing is it just because of the situation now in Russia that has not unfolded what we thought, where would be a massive attacks against us or the West, or actually more against Ukraine, is probably more based on geopolitical issues, and the fact that Russians thought this thing would be over in a few days and didn't prepare for it. But it's also based on the fact that they have their hands full, and that we have better defenses than we did a few months ago because of a focus, as Alzar said, on infrastructure, where the administration has put out a zero trust memorandum and is pushing certainly a higher look into the vulnerabilities associated with our energy infrastructure. So to get to your bottom line, though, it's really all of them, and nowadays you cannot differentiate because it's very difficult digitally to prove who did it.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment on that?
Let me just underscore that, and Serge and Elzar, if you want to comment. I think the pithy response is there is no difference. And attribution, both direct and indirect, has always been one of the most difficult challenges in cybersecurity, in trying to post hoc analyze a cyber attack. Who did it? And who asked that it be done? And again, I'll raise the question of two-edged swords. Because one of the things we're seeing, and General Alexander commented on this, one of the things we're seeing in the Ukraine is a whole set of Western players, Western actors, that are not under the thumb of any given government, at least that we know of, that have taken it upon themselves for various reasons, economic, patriotic, whatever, to attack Russia. Good on them as far as I'm concerned. But what that means, again, is I'll go back to what's good for the goose may not be good for the gander. We may not want to limit those because we are benefiting from them in our own case. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it makes for, again, full employment for us folks involved in cybersecurity, particularly from the policy standpoint.
All right, so to that point, you've got non-state actors who are now entering into this conflict. Do you predict that this might be something we're going to see more of in the future? Absolutely.
That's my prediction. And again, there are various motives, none of which are pure, or none of which stand alone. That's probably a better way to say it. There may be some economic incentive. There may be some patriotic incentive. There may be the morality of it. I think we're seeing that from Western attacks on Russia, like Anonymous. I don't believe they stand to gain anything economically or financially, but they're just responding to what they believe to be Russian cyber attacks. Again, it's a wild west out there. And I think governments are hampered in the ability to control that, in part because it's the Wild West, but in part because, again, they may be benefiting from some of this as well as being the victim of some of it.
I think we certainly have seen Anonymous going after U.S. Organizations and government agencies for years. So it was kind of nice to see them turn their attention somewhere else and get off of our back and, go point your cannon at Russia for a little while. And so far, not attributed to Anonymous, but the hacking into the Russia's Federal Air Transport Agency and supposed disruption there and deletion of a bunch of data. Certainly, it's nice to know that they focus on other people as well, but it does get back to those conversations, those bright lines, and maybe that wasn't a nation-state attack. It was this proxy actor out there, and Ukraine broadcasts the call for help and this IT army that they're asking for. And so everyone goes to war with Russia, but that doesn't mean that the cannon's not going to be pointed, to Ron's point, right back at us whenever Anonymous decides to be irritated with us, and they were going after the payment card brands a few years ago. So it really is the just the event of the moment, I think.
And let me just underscore that one of the most famous anonymous attacks, and I mean capital A Anonymous, the organization, happened in the state of Florida. They literally shut down the city of Fort Lauderdale over a disagreement over homelessness policy. Again, no economic gain, no financial gain, policy disagreement. And as Serge said, it's good that they've turned their sights on, on Russia and the East, and more power to them. Stay there for a while.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, because you bring up the non-governmental impact of cyber, and one area that I think we're going to potentially see more of is also things like the John Deere tractors. So the news story anyway was that the Russians stole a bunch of John Deere combines from Ukraine and transported them to Chechnya, and the Ukrainians used the John Deere interface to shut down the tractors and make them inoperable. And now Russia's trying to figure out how to bypass that. So there's certainly functionality that's being added into technology in general. But I think gets back to your original point of that layering of cybersecurity and who's responsible for it. And it's not just state actors, proxies, organized crime. It's also becoming how businesses are developed and what can you use the cyber capabilities to do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's, when I think about what the differences are versus similarities is the TTPs, right? For any group are normally somewhat similar of how they're going about recon, surveillance, and exploitation. I think the differences are, slightly in motivation, budget, and target selection. And those are kind of the areas that you might see some differences in some of the different groups. But the hard thing is now a lot of the criminal organizations are realizing that they can make less money but have less risk by, renting out or selling their infrastructures to execute these tasks. So it's going to make attribution really hard because things that you might have thought were criminal organizations because it's coming from a certain network or they're using a certain exploitation technology might be somebody else, a nation state, a proxy group renting out that technology and then selecting whatever target they want to go after.
It's like you can buy anything on the dark web, right, Elzar?
Right.
Whenever I visit it, I feel like taking a shower afterwards. But if you want to buy even the most sophisticated cyber attack tools, they're for sale somewhere there. Scott, it likens me back to something I believe you were involved in your youth, as in mine, the global war on terrorism. One of the biggest fears was the lone wolf. And I think we have the same fear with cyber attacks. The lone wolf who has access to sophisticated tools, or may just be a computer genius, but they don't have to have a whole lot of state-sponsored infrastructure to perpetrate an attack that is significantly damaging. And again, I think we're fortunate that right now everybody's attention is focused on Russia and the Ukraine, but as that winds down, and knock on wood, it will eventually, we're back to the wild, wild west again.
Yeah, going back to Elzar's point, the sharing has really become a business in itself. And there's referral fees, there's all kinds of arrangements. Now it's really organized crime at its height. And as you saw yesterday, even a college in Illinois, it's been around for 100 years, Lincoln College, was basically taken out of business. So the implications there are they're going for whatever the lowest hanging fruit, usually ransomware attacks, often educational institutions or healthcare institutions, and they're reaping in a lot of ransomware money with cryptocurrency now. So the game has changed. Ransomware has been around for years, but the game has changed, and they realize it. And it's not just your brick and mortar crime now; it's become digital crime, and that's still predominantly the biggest threat to businesses in the United States and everywhere. It's from those networks of loosely affiliated criminal gangs.
I think too.
The old joke of the bear chasing two hikers, and one hiker says to the other, "All I need to do is outrun you. I don't need to outrun the bear." Yeah. That's a very shorthand version of that much more elaborate joke. But I think that's what companies are facing, right? Chuck mentioned low-hanging fruit. If I'm not low-hanging fruit and my competitor is, that's okay by me. I'm one step ahead of that other hiker that the bear is going to eat.
Yeah. I think there's also that in between, right? Like you have the individuals who are going after organizations and conducting ransomware attacks, but you also have the security researchers, right, who are looking at a application or looking at an environment, conducting an exploitation of that environment, not doing anything malicious, but then contacting the organization to say, hey, I have access to your information. And then they're requesting some kind of fee for, their researching fee. So I think you also have that weird in between when you have individuals just making money off of exploitation without doing anything technically, malicious to the organization itself.
Okay, so our first question from the audience, and which is a really good one, I think. It says, what kind of cyber attacks can U.S. businesses expect, and what are the lines between kinetic and cyber war?
Well, in terms of expecting, I mean, the most common attack is still phishing. The difference, I think, nowadays is a lot of these attacks are automated. So they're reinforced with machine learning capabilities, so they can target thousands or hundreds of thousands of businesses at the same time, and all you need is a couple bytes. So phishing is still the most predominantly ones. And of course, there's distributed denial of service attacks, which are aimed against websites and companies. More of a nuisance, and you could protect against those too. But those still are the predominant attacks used against businesses, and they usually start with, because there's known vulnerabilities or people just don't practice basic cyber hygiene.
There's something there that I want to build on a little bit, though, Chuck, because I think you and I both know that, there's the phishing attack. Hey, I'm a Nigerian prince. Send me your social security number, and I'll send you $1 million. That most of us are pretty used to at this point and aren't going to respond to. But there's also the really more nefarious ones. I think the evolution of phishing has been those attacks from your trusted partners that maybe have a document that you talk to this person all the time, and you open documents from them all the time, and the English is better. And so it's less about, hey, don't talk or don't respond to emails from people that you don't know, because the threat actors are targeting the people whose job it is to open emails from people they don't know. HR departments, right? If I send my resume into an HR department, that's their entire job, is to open attachments from people they don't know. So we're definitely seeing an evolution in the phishing campaigns that I think a lot of people just say, okay, I can do phishing training and my employees suddenly won't open these phishing attacks anymore. And we just need to be ready for that next evolution, or the next step, the impact of that first tier phish that gets past our defenses.
Absolutely, and they're using social media to find out about you, and social engineering the attacks. It really is. It's not the graphics anymore that look or the Nigerian emails, as you said. It's really professional. It could be your company logo, it could be your bank. So it is a much more difficult scenario now to determine what's official and what is not.
You mean not everything on the web is believable? I do think there's good news in all of this, at least good news in quotes, is that the vast majority of attacks remain the result of frontline employees, not cybersecurity professionals, but frontline employees doing something dumb, something that violates basic cyber hygiene. Now, maybe the bar has been raised a bit, Chuck, with the sophistication of spear phishing attacks and other things, but it still takes a person, whether it's an individual citizen or somebody who works for a private company or a government agency, to click on something. And it's not an evil computer genius, in some laboratory in, the suburbs of Moscow. It's something much less sophisticated, but that's all it takes. Again, that means that companies should be spending a lot more time on cyber hygiene. Even if the bar has been raised, you can still train frontline employees to respond when in doubt by contacting professionals like you and Elzar and Serge. And to me, ultimately that's good news. It's not a very esoteric ones and zeros kind of attack that only you and Serge and Elzar can detect.
Yeah, and to your guys' point too, social engineering has always been a problem, will always continue to be a problem. And then, as everybody stated, spears phishing is getting really, really good. And those are some areas that we're definitely concerned about. But I want to bring up two other areas too that we're still seeing a decent amount of attacks in, and it's kind of the exploitation of public-facing applications. So any kind of like SaaS product or people's websites, we're still seeing a lot of SQL injections that are aimed at exploiting data, actually pulling that information out. So we're still seeing a fair amount of that, and we're also seeing a decent amount of compromised of software dependencies. So when you think of the fact that a lot of applications have third-party dependencies and libraries that are being used from places like GitHub and things like that, and then it's that making sure that we have that trust in any kind of third-party library that you're putting into your applications is extremely important. And the U.S. government's doing a good job of, they released the 800-218, the secure software development framework that's come out that we expect to get even more information about in the next week or two here, hopefully, about how companies can really shift left and start to attest that they're actually, conducting and developing, secure software.
Yeah. Very interesting discussion, and I've got a very specific follow-up for it. But going to your phishing thing, I've met somebody, well, that's not true. I have a friend out there that's so concerned about my car warranty, I can't wait to meet this guy, because about 3 times a day, I get an inquiry from him about, am I going to renew a car warranty for a car that's not even out of warranty? So here's a specific question that came in. It's a follow-up to this discussion here. And the question is, what can Americans do to protect themselves? We have Norton, we have McAfee and that kind of stuff, but can you give specific details on what a private citizen can do to try to protect themselves even more?
Yeah, I think, first of all, have multi-factor authentication. That's a very good barrier. Strong passwords, certainly update your computer and patch it. Make sure you have your data backed up, look at your Wi-Fi and your routers too, make sure they're secure. Those are all the basics. And I think anyone can do that. You don't need a cybersecurity expert or a company to do that for you. And so that's, I think, the best way to fortify it as an individual.
Okay.
I think both corporate and personal, it is to just be acceptive of security and aware of it and ask the questions. That the security by design is that buzzword concept that we talk about of baking security into things. But for years, no one ever says, should I be able to see this? Or should I be able to go here? Or, hey, wait a minute, when's the last time that I changed my password? And so having that a little bit inquisitive mindset of just asking those questions is critical to this whole process, because the users, unfortunately, oftentimes fight back against that multi-factor authentication. It's too hard. How do I do that? I don't like to have to carry my phone with me. We see a lot of people with state and local governments and agencies say, well, my company or my agency can't put something on my personal phone in order to provide that MFA token. I won't let them use my phone. And then that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to rolling out those solutions. So I would say, along with Chuck's specific comments there, it really is being inquisitive about security and looking and seeing how would I choose a product that's more secure. And I'm going to choose this product and vote with your pocketbook of saying and vote with your wallet, because I'm going to choose this product not because it's the cheapest, but because it's the more secure. And with that, we'll advance security over time.
Right.
Yeah, I think the hope too is that you start to see more things like FIDO, right? To have that fast identity online, and FIDO, I think it's currently at FIDO 2, but to move towards the passwordless authentication and really having the private key on a device, whether it's a mobile device or a computer itself, and making the authentication easier. And I think it's one of those things you have to start preparing for users to continue to do the wrong thing, and then you have to try to find technology that makes it easier for them to authenticate the networks, but it's also more secure. And I'm hoping things like FIDO are kind of that route that drive us there.
Scott, can I channel you for a second and ask Chuck and Serge and Elzar what they think about cyber insurance, both from a company standpoint or government agency standpoint, but mainly from a company standpoint, and also from an individual standpoint, things like LifeLock. should citizens be A, shopping only those companies that are cyber insured, and or B, should they be buying their own personal cyber insurance policy?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that because I want to tie it to an earlier conversation that we had earlier this morning about Florida banning the payment of ransom to for state agencies. And I think it'd be a really interesting conversation the first time a state agency calls up their insurance company and says, hey, this ransom is $50,000, but I can't pay it. Instead, I'm going to put in a claim for $5 or $6 million in business interruption and data recovery and everything else. And the insurance company is going to be going, wait a minute, how about paying the $50,000 in ransom to get your decryption key? So it is an interesting dichotomy with cyber insurance. That said, certainly it helps clean up after the fact, but cyber insurers are also getting involved in trying to mandate some protections in order to get cyber insurance. It's just like, you probably can't get insurance for your, or it's going to be a lot more, to insure your Stanley steamer with no bumpers and no seat belts and no airbags. So the cyber insurers are starting to look at that and saying, well, if you don't have that list that Chuck gave us a little while ago of multi-factor authentication and FIDO and all those other security tools, then you're either uninsurable or you're going to pay a lot more for it.
Do you think that there's a opportunity for a speedier move, I guess, technology-wise, to get away from passwords? I mean, about 90% of the time I got to say forgot password and go get a new one because I don't like to write them down and carry them with me. But what about, rushing towards fingerprint recognition, voice recognition, iris recognition, facial recognition, so we can get away from the passwords?
Well, it's happening now. You see that on a lot of Apple products with the facial recognition. I think eventually biometrics are the way to go, but not everyone will adopt that. There's also password managers that make it easier, but a lot of people are saying the passwords are going to be obsolete very soon. And, I think the only way really to ensure it's you is really those kind of a portfolio of biometrics. But people, are concerned with those too being deep faked. So there's still issues.
I have every confidence, Chuck, that you and Serge and Elzar and your colleagues, your criminal colleagues, not you all, but your criminal colleagues will figure out a way around even biometric authentication. Yeah. This is a chess game. There's a move, there's a counter move, there's a counter move. That's not to say you should ignore it. I think as defenses become more sophisticated, that's a good thing. But we shouldn't, at the same time, we shouldn't rest on our laurels because there are cyber criminals out there who are trying to figure out how they can spoof retinal scans or fingerprints or use deep fakes to mimic facial recognition, etc.
Right.
Mm. I would say too, just to circle back quickly on the idea of cyber insurance, I think it's an important part of any risk management program. Of, when you look at the idea of risk, do you accept it, reject it? And then you have the idea of, do you transfer that risk to a third party organization via cyber insurance policy? And I would say to companies that are doing that to make sure you look at the fine print, as Serge has said, that it's not just what are you doing proactively, it's also then when something happens, how do you respond? And if you don't follow, a very specific possible, game plan or process in the response phases, they're also going to hold you accountable and may not pay. So I would say for people who are going that route of transferring the risk, just make sure that you are reading the policies carefully and you're executing exactly what it says. It's going to be really difficult to get the pay out the end.
Elzar, can I ask a quick follow-on? Scott, I don't mean to preempt you, but I believe either this week or next, the state of Florida is convening a special legislative session to look at property insurance. Is cyber insurance not far behind? Could that eventually become like flood insurance and become a government responsibility?
You mean for the individual?
And or organizations?
So I think most organizations are either self-insured when it comes to cyber, or I think a lot of the generic policies normally have a cyber insurance kind of a, appendix type of thing. I think companies that are, really focused on and really concerned about that might dig deeper into the appendix or request additional services, things like that. So I think a lot of them are kind of standard for a lot of, I'm not an insurance expert, but I believe a lot of them are standard for a lot of like generic corporate insurance policies. I think for the individual, when you're talking about the idea of like a LifeLock or something like that, because it's more geared at identity, right? Identity theft, things like that. I think they're good programs, but also the same. You need to understand of what they're actually going to do for you, how much they're going to cover, and then what they're really going to help you with. Whether it's going to each, credit bureau and explain to them that wasn't you, and kind of removing those charges or getting your identity back. But I think they're good programs, but I think they're kind of reactive to something bad has happened. Your identity was stolen, which is a part of what could be the idea of an attack. And then what do we do now versus being obviously trying to move more to the proactive side.
So maybe the government function is to educate citizens and consumers, like a buying guide, what to look for, what to guard against, etc., rather than making it a like flood insurance government program.
Well, I saw that Florida, I guess, recently introduced at schools. They're doing financial training, I think, for students. I think something similar should probably happen from a cybersecurity perspective, across the country would be great, right? To see students at a very young age, have government mandates, and no one likes government mandates, but having it within the institutions, within the schools, learning about these things early on to be able to, be more proactive and contribute, I think, overall.
Scott, I'll apologize shamelessly, but that requires me to put in another plug for Cyber Florida. The Florida Department of Education has given us a $20 million, that is 20 with an M, $1 million grant to fund local school districts, colleges, and universities on cyber IT educational pathways, curriculum programs, teacher development, etc. We are reviewing grant applications literally as we speak, with announcements later this month or early June. But at least the state of Florida is taking that sort of public education seriously, because again, our experience has been that too many kids, digital natives, take all of this stuff for granted, and they're frankly worse than old folks like me when it comes to guarding against cyber attacks.
Well, that's great news. I think that fact that you're starting earlier, particularly in the lower grades, is really important. Really, that type of education is proactive, and it needs to be replicated by every state.
Yeah. And to that point, the Air Force Association has a program out there that educates K through 12 on cyber attacks. Well, cyber, not attacks. It's called Cyber Patriot. And in session 5, we're going to talk about that in more in depth. But to your point, Ron, this is a massive opportunity that we have got to do better at educating our youth in. And Cyber Patriot is one of those ways that we're doing it. I know that you're coupled with that one also. So, okay, shifting gears, back to our second session. I have 2 questions that refer back to that. And the second session was focused on economics, if you would, and the economic impact on Europe and the world and the U.S. So the first question comes: cybersecurity is a massive issue in the global financial and economic war that we discussed in the second session. How does the panel see the integration of cyber defense and cyber finance? And Serge, we'll start with you on that one.
Thanks. What a mess. So I think there's a definite blend and incorporation of crypto into all of that. So we can't really talk about finance anymore without introducing cryptocurrency into that. And both the economic impact of organized crime and then the impact against citizens longer term. So two-part answer. One is the direct attacks against individuals and organized crime going out there, or nation states going out there and launching campaigns to get into bank accounts, to drain people's accounts, to steal cryptocurrency wallets and move those funds, and the obviously financial impact of that. And that's been going on for a while, but certainly increasing in frequency. One of the big attacks recently was attributed to the Russians, and then some other Eastern European actors. Another one is from an organized crime perspective. I think it's interesting to think that years ago, when organized crime was stateside, and we would have the mafia shaking down individuals in New York, the money was staying in the U.S. And we were then buying more expensive cars in the U.S. and we're paying taxes on sales taxes, not necessarily income taxes, I guess, but sales tax on the services. But the money's staying in the U.S. And here we're faced with something where a lot of those financial attacks are directly impacting U.S. citizenry, but now the dollars are flowing offshore, and so it's almost like a double impact, and probably because of that, more of an economic impact.
Okay, Chuck?
Chuck. I will say that the financial services industry, it was one of the earliest targets of cyber attacks. And as a consequence, they are probably among the best defended, the most collaborative. They probably do the best job in terms of information sharing when it comes to cyber attacks. So viewers should not run off and take their money out of a bank and put it in their under their mattress. Their money is largely, if not totally secure, in part because the financial services industry has been at the tip of the spear, both in terms of attacks and in terms of defending them. And as a result, and to further backstop those defenses, they've also pioneered lots and lots of cyber insurance. In fact, to the point where I personally think citizens take that fact for granted. You know, if somebody steals my credit card information, for example, the Bank of America or Visa will make it good. And as a result, we become less vigilant. That's a different issue, but again, just to make sure everyone understands, financial services, again, pretty sophisticated, maybe the most sophisticated, and so our money is generally safe. I tell my wife that all the time.
I agree with that, Ron. Particularly financial service and gaming industry. They were the leaders in this, particularly the casinos out in Las Vegas. But I think the problem is still with small and medium business, which are the largest targets of these attacks, and they're, you know, the estimated attack value globally is in the trillions coming in the next few years. So it is a very serious issue, and there's plenty of targets, unfortunately. And even with the financial industry, they couldn't get to the banks, so they're going to the financial advisors and loosely affiliated groups. So there's always targets for these people. And I think the good news is on the other side of the coin, there's a lot more investment, VC investment, M&A happening in the cyber world. A lot of new technologies brought online, and a lot more focus in policy areas too, particularly with the government and particularly critical infrastructure. So I think we're at least recognizing the issue. It's going to be a tough fight though, because there's just too many vulnerabilities, too much of an attack surface, and too many people still out there that are ill-informed or just don't want to do the basics.
Chuck, let me ask a follow-on very quickly to that last point. Should that become something that we as citizens should include as we shop around? Don't use a bank that isn't as cyber secure as its competitor or a financial advisor or whatever. Should that be part of our thinking and maybe part of our training for young kids?
I 100%. And I always looked at it, cybersecurity is really not a cost issue for a company or a bank. It's an investment in their operations and future. So I think anytime you could look at that as a consumer, where you go where you're going to be fortified and strong and you're protected, is really something that's good for the reputation of that bank and company, and it's also good for you. So yes, is the answer, 100%.
The interesting thing too is NIST for a while, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, we're floating around the idea of software labeling. of labeling an actual application to say whether it's been attested to at a certain level. So I'd be curious to see if the government comes out with that kind of narrative when it comes to actually labeling a piece of software that organization, whether you're going to be a partner with them or a consumer or a client, can actually see how the software was developed and see if it meets a certain criteria.
So they do it with food, right?
All right.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point too, Eldar, getting all the way back to your comment about security researchers. And now we're talking about security or software design. There was a matter in October of last year where the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did some analysis of a website in Missouri and realized that the software had been kind of poorly designed. It was exposing social security numbers of teachers, and reported it to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and then wrote a story about it. And the governor came out and he's vowing to prosecute the newspaper for disclosing this cybersecurity vulnerability. So but it comes full circle back to somehow we need to also be worried about that software development process and some sort of UL Labs seal of good housekeeping, something.
I was just going to say, Serge, that's a great idea for you entrepreneurs, you and Chuck and Elzar, an underwriter's lab for cybersecurity. Maybe the insurance industry would fund it. But yeah, we can look at a lamp and tell that it's safe to plug in. It's not going to cause a fire because it's got the UL label. And we can look at a energy bar and see how many calories and other things are included in it. Maybe we need the same for software.
Yeah, and I think we might be seeing the first steps. So executive order last year identified, the importance of the supply chain risk management and software being a big part of that. And I'm hoping that in the next few weeks that we get some kind of guidance from either OMB or the White House that talks about how companies have to attest to the new framework being NIST 800-218, that secure software development framework. And I think that's going to be, I'm hoping that's the first step to really starting to identify, like, hey, organizations need to identify how they're building software, and they need to have either internal attestation or third-party attestation, kind of showing that, yes, we do these, 40-some practices identified in this document. So I'm hoping that's kind of the start to it, that makes it more of a labeling process, or at least kind of, pushes the idea of shifting left, but do have concerns with small and medium businesses to be able to compete and actually achieve that. So that is a concern, though.
So as a consumer, I can honestly say I don't think I've ever thought about cyber when watching advertising, reading advertising. Maybe it's not out there, I don't know. But Bank of America, other banks, that's probably something they're going to start thinking about in advertising. I can see the day coming where Consumer Reports has their cyber issue about their top 10 rated and everything else, because that's the way we're moving. And there's a vast void out there of education for us laymen, to say the least. Okay, I've got
in a meager attempt to bring this back to the topic of our discussion, if there is a silver lining in the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and the cyber aspects of it, it's the fact that all of a sudden now we're hyper aware of that. I think what the president did a few weeks ago was extraordinary, to basically warn American businesses, you better be cyber secure, you better be cyber vigilant, because they're coming. I think, again, without the Russian invasion, that warning never would have taken place, and people like us would continue preaching, mostly to largely empty rooms, that folks got to get cyber secure. And now all of a sudden you've got the president of the United States saying, everybody, you better be on notice.
Well, the law of unintended consequences has definitely played in that scenario, and also, as General Alexander said this morning, with NATO is more united now than they ever have been. U.S. is doing a Lend-Lease law now, which that signed into law yesterday by President Biden. I don't think Putin ever dreamed the sanctions would be what they were. So this unintended consequences definitely played in. All right, I have time for one last question here. And I think this will be it, because if everybody comments on it, I think we'll be right up against the stop. So in the second session, we discussed the Federal Reserve and inflation. Do you see the Fed being a target of Russia and or China? And if so, would those attacks cripple the U.S. economy, and how? Chuck, over to you.
I'm not privy to it, but I'm sure they've already been the subject of attacks. And as going back to it, what we were talked about with Ron earlier, the financial community is well prepared, more than compared to other industries, for these type of attacks. I don't think the way they segment the information and control, it's more like done with coordination, like DoD or the intelligence community does. So there's plenty of backup and plenty of interesting tools being used right now. But I would not ever count out an attack by adversaries against the Federal Reserve or other institutions such as or areas like the grid that will have a devastating impact if they needed to do it. But it would be an act of war, I would think.
Right. Elzar?
I would agree. I would say that I can't imagine that they haven't attempted to do some kind of recon or surveillance or try to do their best to embed themselves in these networks. But to everybody's point, I think the redundancy of the financial systems are pretty robust. So it makes me feel better. I think the biggest thing would be the indirect impact, that if there was an attack against that organization, even though if it wasn't what we would consider successful, really impactful, the secondary impacts of the misinformation and disinformation that comes out of that attack, right? The media coverage, the social media commentary, things that could lead to people to panic a little bit that are just malinformed information. So I think that would be a concern.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ron, your thoughts here?
I do think we need to look at the Russia and China threats differently. China's economy is so intertwined with the US's and Europe's that if they were to attack our financial systems, it would hurt them almost as much as it hurts us. So I think their strategy of IP theft is probably, I'm sure they're considering military doctrine as well, but as a general matter, I don't think it helps them to hurt us. Russia, on the other hand, is different. We've all alluded to this. Russia sending cruise missiles in to bomb a school or a hospital. I don't know whether it's because they're inept and they can't precisely target those cruise missiles, or because they just don't care. And they don't care what they destroy. Both of those are bad things. But I do think that the Russian threat is something more to worry about, because they don't care. Their economy isn't as intertwined, and hurting us, especially with somebody like Putin at the controls, hurting us may not matter as much to them as it is to the Chinese. One last point, I do think while the Federal Reserve is well defended and it likely would be able to thwart any attack, the panic that an attack would cause, even if it's unsuccessful, particularly with social media being what it is, bot-driven, etc., it's more the panic that I worry about than it is the actual impact of an attack.
Okay, and Serge, any final thoughts here?
It was interesting. China's slogan for the 2008 Olympic Games, which is arguably their coming out party to the world, was "One World, One Dream." And they definitely have a long-term plan and are good at focusing and understand that you can win things via economics as opposed to military. And Russia has been a little bit more of that bear and just throwing their weight around and try to accomplish their objectives with military might. And China is a lot more insidious about this. So when you start talking about Federal Reserve, I would certainly agree with Elzar Chuck's comments that an attack against that directly would probably be one of those bright lines, active war type response. And yet there's probably been people poking at that all day long, and they've got some fairly good defenses and resiliency. However, attacks against the stock market and private companies and impacting private company stock and making money on those stock trades, if you know that you're going to launch a cyber attack and short a stock and can basically, again, suck money out of the U.S. economy and pull it into your pocket, is certainly a good economic play from somebody that wants to weaken the United States, as well as, like General Alexander is saying, that theft of intellectual property and forcing us to redevelop. So I think those are probably the economic attacks that we'll continue to see, as opposed to any direct attack against the Fed or something like that.
Okay, well, thank you. So on behalf of the Air Force Association, University of South Florida, I want to thank Chuck, Elzar, Ron, and Serge for an absolutely dynamic panel. This discussion was just very, very educational, very enlightening, and at times very scary. But thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your openness and honesty. So thank you very much. It would have been impossible, in my opinion, to pick a better closer than we had with General McLaughlin today. As he mentioned, he is an Air Force Academy grad. He commanded at every level of the United States Air Force and was a recognized expert in space and in cyber.
Good morning. It's great to be with you today. And I look forward to this discussion, and I applaud what the Air Force Association's been doing in their speaker series. And today they've asked if I would speak for a few minutes on the cyber situation as I see it in the Ukraine and Russia conflict. And I know you've had some great speakers and a great panel already today, but I look forward to adding some perspective to this discussion based on my experience. What I would like to do is kind of build a little bit of a case that what we're seeing in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia is just sort of a natural set of events on the path that our country is on, in how we think about cyber and warfare, how we think about the leveraging our capabilities that we've invested in, and really puts a bit of a spotlight on the maturing capabilities at the United States Cyber Command. I'd like to speak for a few minutes as we can kind of build up to that on cyberspace as a domain of warfare. Just a very short few words about it. Some of the strategic threats that we've been dealing with that have sort of provoked the response the U.S. has undergone as we've created these capabilities to fight our wars in cyberspace. And I'll talk about a few of the things that we've done about it in response. But then I'll get into the meat of this and really give you my sense of what's happening in the Ukraine and certainly what could happen next. Of course, my conjecture is as good as anybody's. I'm not in the middle of what's actually going on, but there are a lot of glimpses the administration and U.S. Cyber Command is providing us, and so I'll give you a little bit of that and then talk a bit about what I think might be happening. Just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Texas, where I'm speaking to you from today. I graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1983 and spent 34 years on active duty in a space operations, space warfare, and cyberspace warfare set of experiences. I've been married to Victoria for 36 years, and we have 4 children and 4 grandchildren, and 2 of them are showing up here in about 3 days for Grandma Camp. And I've been retired since 2017, and I do spend time in an advisory consulting business, serve on a number of boards. I do lead a cyber policy and strategy program at the George Bush School at Texas A&M, and try to stay active in this space as I think it's important and something that I'm certainly fascinated by. My perspective on this issue, though, is as a practitioner of cyber warfare at the operational and strategic levels. I'm not a coder, but I have had the opportunity to be part of growing and scaling the capabilities our nation is building in the Department of Defense to execute cyber operations. I was part of that at U.S. Cyber Command and at Air Force's Cyber during a formative time in both organizations' ascendancy. I do have kind of a realist view of the world as it relates to national security and policy, and we'll share that with you as we get into this. And I really focus a lot of my attention today on furthering our national discussion on integrated deterrence and the role that cyber can play in integrated deterrence. Why is it so important? Why is this issue even something that we're spending some time talking about? It's not just because we have countries that attack each other or in cyber, or that we have major hacks that happen in our society. It's because of the risk that it drives for our country. Cyber is certainly the driver behind everything in our society, how it functions, how it's connected. It has embedded vulnerabilities, though, that bring major risk and dangers, not just to the military, but every person in our country and many in the world. It is also complicated because it blends both private and government infrastructure and interest, and it creates almost more than we can keep track of, countless cultural, technical, legal, and policy issues that we don't really fully understand as a nation, but we are getting after them quickly. And I will say, though, still today, this is a topic that's talked about all the time, but often with not much clarity and not a lot of understanding among senior policymakers, just because it's changing so quickly. And that means that the people that, like those leaders at U.S. Cyber Command today, have become real experts in speaking and not in jargon or in technical lexicon, but in English, as they describe the courses of action that they're proposing and why, and what the risk might be based on different decisions that the president and the leaders of the country might make. And so this is a very important topic, and I applaud the AFA for even raising it. Cyber is certainly viewed as a domain of warfare. It is different than the other naturally occurring domains of warfare of air, land, sea, and space. Those domains have always existed, and you really can't change them. But cyber is created by humans, and it can be changed by humans or machines. And our warfighters that operate in cyberspace not only have to maneuver through the domain, but they have to maneuver and change and modify the domain itself at the same time. And they've got to counter adversaries who do the same. Our national defenders and warfighters have to defend vast and complex cyber terrain. You'll hear in a few minutes that terrain today includes the cyber terrain in other countries around the world, such as the Ukraine. And it's no longer realistic just to think we can keep adversaries out of our own networks, just like it's probably not realistic to think you can keep them out of your computer at home if they were really devoted to try to get in. And so we have to counter those adversaries that might have deep and long-term access to our networks. And that is a particularly difficult task. We do have strategic threats in cyberspace, and those threats, as they became recognized in our country, the ones that caused us to say we're going to create U.S. Cyber Command, and we're going to create large numbers of cyber forces, and we started that journey when the command was created in 2010, and when we started working on the cyber mission force in 2013, even at a time when sequestration was in effect, and we were parking operational squadrons of fighters on the ground. I remember when I was at the headquarters Air Force. At the same time we were parking those fighter squadrons, we were building up a cyber mission force of over 6,200 people because of the threats. And the threats that we see today, that we discussed today, and we're going to look at how those are manifesting in Ukraine, are big countries like Russia and China who use and leverage cyber as a means to a set of strategic ends. And they do it for various reasons, but some of the larger or the most significant reasons that we've coined recently are to both impose internal control on their own population, which might not be significant to us, but they also seek to deter the United States and our allies. They use cyber as an aggressive foreign policy tool, which we'll see in a few minutes, some examples of how Russia has done so in the recent years. And they execute what we call corrosive cyber attacks, which are intended to create long-term strategic harm to the United States. I'll tell you a little bit more about those corrosive cyber attacks in a few minutes. As I mentioned, Russia, in their efforts to deter the United States, have been very clear in recent years when it suits their interest. They have conducted destructive cyber attacks in countries where there was something where they wanted to pressure, or there was a geopolitical reason that caused them to want to do that. They took down Ukrainians' electrical grid in 2015 and 2016. They also even before that, one of the first and most significant destructive cyber attacks in history were what the Russians did to Estonia. And the Estonians found themselves the focus of severe cyber attacks, information warfare, and fake news, and it really impacted their government's ability to operate. They couldn't communicate via the news. Their financial systems were under fire, and so the Russians have shown when it suits their interest, they use cyber attacks as part of their foreign policy, and they want also countries like the U.S. to see that if you have vulnerable critical infrastructure or vulnerable things that your country depends on, the Russians very well might choose to try to attack it, and that is one way the Russians try to be aggressive with cyber as part of their foreign policy and seek to deter countries that might be contesting the Russians, like we see today in Ukraine. Not only are the Russians fighting the Ukrainians, but the West is contesting the Russians' ability to do so, and cyber is playing a role. But we'll talk in a few minutes what we've seen so far and what could still be to come. Did mention that I would like to talk to you a little bit about corrosive cyber attacks. That's a term that was coined by General Paul Nakasone. General Nakasone is the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency. And he coined these attacks, corrosive cyber attacks, because they are like corrosion, like something that might slowly destroy. These corrosive cyber attacks are attacks that occur below the level of armed conflict. They occur over very long periods of time, and they consist of lots of individually inconsequential, yet cumulatively strategically consequential effects on our nation and on others. The four areas that they usually focus on are first, stealing what has been unprecedented quantities of intellectual property and personal information. Some have called that the greatest transfer of wealth in history. That's the stealing of U.S. and Western governments' intellectual property just for the use of either Russian or Chinese use. And they are able to make economic benefit out of that, especially by not having to invest the trillions of dollars of IP that went into it. They also use corrosive cyber attacks to disrupt democratic processes and institutions. We saw this at play in the 2016 presidential election, and we have been focused on preventing that type of disruption in the 2018 midterms, the 2020 election, and when we get to the 2022 midterms, General Nakasone is already building the plans to protect something that we hold very dear as Americans. Third, these critical corrosive cyber attacks can go after and hold U.S. critical infrastructure at risk. Things like electric power, transportation, our financial industry, things that our country has to have available for all Americans. And so those are all powered by computers, powered by cyber capabilities, both information technology and what we call operational technology. And much of that was fielded before there was a lot of thought given to how you might need to defend it. And so it's a very broad set of cyber terrain that would have to be defended. And the Russians in particular know that terrain is there. And they've actually at times had malware in our U.S. critical infrastructure, and the government has called them out on it and even told the public that was the case. And so that's another type of corrosive cyber attack. And the last thing I will say is that these are all aimed at eroding U.S. power over time. But because they take place below the level of armed conflict, they're not necessarily intended to cause a conventional type of war. And so for quite a while, the United States was struggling with how should we or how might we respond to this. So what are some of the things we've been doing about it as a country? I won't list them all, but I will just say in the last several years, there has been an avalanche of DoD and national level strategies and policies, posture reviews, studies on deterrence, and so we have new forward-leaning strategies and policy across the United States, and they all confirm sort of a drive towards some broad trends. First, focusing more and more on enabling and authorizing active cyber operations and on how cyber can contribute to deterrence broadly. Second, these all focus on a concerted effort of protecting critical infrastructure of the United States. And there is a real drive towards stronger partnering both inside the U.S. government, between the U.S. government and the U.S. private sector, and between the United States and our allies. And again, we're about to transition to talking about the Ukraine specifically, but all of these policies have established the conditions and really teed up those conditions so that now that when we're faced with something like the Ukraine, we're somewhat ready to deal with it. We certainly did create U.S. Cyber Command, as I mentioned, because of these trends back in 2010. We're not going to speak as much about it, but we've also been strengthening the Department of Homeland Security's CISA organization, and CISA stands for Cybersecurity and Information or an Infrastructure Security Agency. And so that's sort of the civil side of U.S. cybersecurity. And they are also having their budgets and their manpower strengthened. Probably the most significant thing that's happened is in the Trump administration, we implemented a brand new strategy called the Persistent Engagement Strategy. That strategy was first authorized by some new presidential authorities. The President Trump signed a new set of authorities that delegated a lot more authority to DoD, to the Department of Defense, to both really to contest all of those corrosive cyber attacks that have been happening below the level of armed conflict. So when General Nakasone was given those new authorities, he began to posture his forces both within United States Cyber Command and within the National Security Agency, which he, since he leads both of them. And the first public example of when he used these new authorities was in the 2018 midterms. He stood up a group called the Russia Small Group. He appointed a senior general officer and a senior executive inside NSA and Cyber Command to lead that group. And they really began to cut their teeth on how they would actually contest against the Russians every day. It's almost like it's a knife fight below the level of armed conflict occurring in cyberspace. And by all accounts, while the details have not been released, General Nakasone's spoken about this in published articles and in his congressional testimony, and it's been written about to some degree by some of the press. And by all accounts, Cyber Command has helped disrupt the Russian attempts to mess up the 2018 midterms or disrupt them in a way that similar to the way they'd done in 2016. So if you fast forward, we also had a thing called the Cyber Solarium Commission, a bipartisan commission, which really focused on the need of the U.S. to implement what they called layered cyber deterrence. So again, a new major effort focused on the United States needing to significantly up its game and how we might deter bad acts from our adversaries in the cyber domain. So all of that I mentioned because it leads us up to the fact that our country has been preparing for what's going on in the Ukraine for a number of years. We weren't 100% sure that we would find this conflict happening in the Ukraine although over the last year or so, it became more and more evident that it was likely. And I know everybody that's listening to this has been paying attention and sort of glued to the news over the last several months because of what's happening there. But what's happened with regard to this crisis when it comes to cyber? Well, it's interesting. I actually see, we all see the Russian president routinely on TV, routinely speaking. And so we hear about the coordinated efforts of the Ukrainian government to push back and fight against the Russians. And to be honest, we see quite a bit about how effective that's been. Doesn't mean that they're not still in a high degree of peril. The outcome is not certain. If anybody tells you they know what's going to happen in Russia and with regard to the Russia-Ukrainian crisis, I don't think they're telling you the truth, because I don't think anybody actually knows. But we do know that it wasn't over in just a few days, and we know a few other things. We know on the cyber side, Russian cyber attacks have been severe. You might think, well, maybe they really haven't tried to use cyber against the Ukrainians. Well, there's quite a bit in the press about this. Both General Nakasone has just recently made some public remarks about how serious the attacks have been. He's not gone into great detail, but he has mentioned attacks against satellite communications. There's been some things in the press about some serious attacks against some Viasat commercial satellite communications. Microsoft has said that at least 6 Russia-backed groups have launched more than 200 attacks against the Ukraine and nearly 40 destructive attacks against critical infrastructure in the Ukraine. And so the Russians have been very active inside the Ukraine, but they have so far not escalated outside of the Ukraine. We're watching that very closely. You might have noticed the U.S. has been careful in some areas not to respond in ways that could bring the U.S. and the Russians directly into military conflict. And maybe the Russians, at least at the moment, have decided that they do not want to escalate this war outside of the borders of Ukraine, and they have not escalated, that we can tell, any cyber attacks outside of Ukraine. And it also looks as if the Ukrainians have managed to stay resilient and continue to function and operate despite those Russian attacks against their IT and their critical infrastructure. Well, why have they been able to be resilient? Well, in addition to how hard they're fighting, I will say part of it's because of what the United States strategy's been. As I mentioned, we have fully implemented this notion of persistent engagement. And you might ask, well, what is it? Well, it's a few things. One is it's giving the authority for U.S. Cyber Command to put both its offensive and its defensive teams in what they call hunt forward operations. Just last year, U.S. Cyber Command conducted 9 hunt forward operations, including General Nakasone said some that have been in the Ukraine. And the commander of the Cyber National Mission Force recently said that they've done almost 30 hunt forward operations in the past 4 years. And these hunt forward operations is when we send cyber teams into the countries of our allies, those countries that we think are most at risk, and they sit side by side with the cyber teams in those countries, and they go through their systems. They go in and help hunt in their systems. They find advanced Russian malware, and they learn and see the Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures. And instead of bringing it back to Fort Meade and studying it in private and in secret for months or years, we've determined that it's actually much more effective just to share all that malware with the world via a commercial provider. So now, as soon as we find this advanced Russian malware that we might pull out of a country's networks, like the Ukrainians, that malware is shared almost instantaneously with the entire world, who can then put counters or defenses in place based on that malware. It's been an extremely effective technique, and we've done that in the Ukraine, and it's I think it would be fair to say that one of the reasons the Ukrainians have been persistent and have been able to continue to operate despite these serious Russian attacks is because the United States and the West have spent money and effort to help them make their systems more resilient and more defendable over the last several years, especially since those Russian attacks that I mentioned a little while ago against the Ukrainian electric infrastructure back in 2015 and 2016. I think that got their attention, and they have been very focused and welcoming of those who are willing to come to their aid. And I think that effort has helped their systems be much more resilient. In addition, as we begin to do this, we also share threat data extensively. As we get this threat data, there might have been times in the past that we considered that data classified, and that we might not share it broadly, even in our own government. Well, now, under this new persistent engagement strategy, General Nakasone has been very open about the fact that the threat data is being shared extensively and immediately with others, not only in the U.S. government, but within the U.S. commercial industry and the sectors that own much of the critical infrastructure. But he's also shared that intelligence directly with our coalition partners. Instead of saying it's not available for them to see because of classification, it's being shared with countries like the Ukraine and other countries in Europe in a way that the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency director, just recently called eye-watering and beyond any that he's ever seen in his long careers as an intelligence officer. And what this is really helping, it's helping combat disinformation, and it's actually kept Russia, as you might can tell in the news, for a country that is so effective in information operations. I think this sharing of intelligence broadly and in a transparent way around the world with our allies has really helped keep the Russians on their heels in the information battle. And at the moment, it's appeared as if the Ukrainians and the West have been winning that information battle for the most part, which has not really been the case in previous years. So all the things that are happening today and the things that have been talked about publicly often are over things that are happening over on the Hill, and they always mention they would have to go into a closed session to talk about the details. So they're not really available to us because the details are classified. But what might happen next? What are some things that we would be criticized if we weren't ready for it, and things that even General Nakasone and others have said that it is still possible? The first is we shouldn't be surprised if things get serious enough for the Russians in terms of them not meeting their objectives. And by the way, it looks as if every day they're at risk of not meeting their objectives in Ukraine. It is possible that they could escalate cyber attacks beyond what they've done so far. General Nakasone's even said that he would look for things like more ransomware attacks, like the ransomware attacks against the Colonial Pipeline in the US last year. You could see Russian proxies, so not Russian government troops, but other groups that might be serving as proxies for the Russian government conducting serious attacks. But we also might see destructive cyber attacks outside of Ukraine against critical infrastructure in other countries in Europe and possibly even the United States. Maybe one reason the Russians haven't done that so far is that the fact that they do realize NATO clarified its policy several years ago and confirmed that a cyber attack against a NATO member would also be legitimately could trigger Article 5, where the rest of NATO would come to that country's defense. And so for the Russians to expand this war in destructive attacks, in particular against European countries that are in NATO or the United States, we absolutely could see that lead into some greater conflict between NATO and the Russians. It is possible, though, just like Russian troops have been in Ukraine and eastern Ukraine and down in the Crimea for the last few years. There are also Russians that are in some Russian-speaking parts of Georgia, and they've been there. Really over a decade. And so there are countries like Georgia that are not part of NATO, where maybe Russia could expand attacks, against other Western or Eastern European countries. Don't know that would be something that would be considered, but we shouldn't be surprised what the Russians might do. We certainly are preparing, as I mentioned, to defend the 2022 midterm elections. General Nakasone said he's already appointed a general officer and a senior NSA civilian to pull together another effort like we did in the 2018 midterms, and they're preparing for that right now. The Cyber Command is also is advocating for growth in the military services on more information operations experts. And General Nakasone said that's the first priority, is to have each of the military services grow that the number of people that are skilled in information operations. But there's a discussion already on the Hill about creating another subordinate command within U.S. Cyber Command that would focus on information operations. So there's a lot still happening that's being driven not only by the conflict in the Ukraine today, but really all the things that have led up to it over the past decade, so that the country was actually very well positioned to be ready to assist and help blunt the attack against the Ukrainians. It seems like there have been times in the past where it looked like the United States was caught unaware, was caught by surprise, was not prepared to deal with something that happened out of the blue. This is a case where my sense is we were prepared. We had done things that helped in partnership with the Ukrainians. We implemented new policies. We took forces that we had been developing for since 2013 in particular, and we put them into the game well before this conflict started, so that we would be prepared to deal with this conflict. So my hat's off to the team and to those leaders in the government that have been doing this. But we still have to think, so what's beyond the Ukraine? And that's how I'll just conclude my remarks. I think the country still has to develop and mature how it thinks with regard to how cyber can contribute more significantly to integrated deterrence. Just because this conflict has stayed within the Ukrainian borders up to this point, it doesn't mean that it will, and it doesn't mean that a future conflict over something different might not put our countries even in more direct crisis, where conflict could be, we could be on the path of escalation to greater conflict. And because of that, the country is certainly thinking. We have the Department of Defense, and the U.S. is focusing on this notion of integrated deterrence. And it's a concept that's well beyond cyber, but it certainly includes how all the domains of warfare, including cyber, could contribute to deterrence. But it also examines how other instruments of U.S. power across what we call the DIME, the DIME, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic levers of power, how all of that could be synchronized in some effective way to help deter those countries, especially Russia and China, that seek to do us harm. And so we're going to continue to look at how cyber specifically can play in that. We'll continue to focus on how we strengthen both U.S. and allied defenses. We do have lots of vulnerable infrastructure. We have networks and systems that were fielded well before we really understood the nature of the cyber threat as we do today. We've had a lot of the information on those systems have been stolen by our adversaries, and they potentially might know a lot about the systems and might know about their vulnerabilities. And so it is an imperative that we continue to strengthen the defenses of those U.S. capabilities and our allied capabilities. I think we've seen that despite serious Russian attacks against the Ukraine, they have been able to operate through those attacks and continue to function. And so that's at least a significant data point that should encourage us to do the same in our countries, in the countries of our allies. And then last, we simply need to continue maturing our U.S. cyber forces, both inside and outside of the U.S. military. You might think, well, the cyber capabilities that I've been talking about are really mature and they're doing great things. Well, they are doing great things, but we just started building the cyber mission forces in 2013, and they were finally at their full operating capability 4 years later in the 2017 or 2018 timeframe. Well, that means those forces today aren't even 10 years old. Those young people that came into the cyber mission force when we started building it aren't even there. They've been in maybe 7 to 9 years. And so that force is maturing rapidly, partly because it's being used and it's in contact with the adversary routinely. But we'll continue to mature those forces. And I think once you see them, up in the 20-year mark, I think you're going to see U.S. Cyber Command and the military services are going to rival any cyber capable organization on the planet. And I think that will continue to be a focus of the U.S. government, both in the military and certainly in places like CISA, as I mentioned, over in the Department of Homeland Security. Will conclude with saying I appreciate your attention today. Certainly appreciate the fact that AFA has focused on this topic, and it'll be good to come back to it at some point in the coming months just to see what has happened. It's such a dynamic space, and be able to see if any of the things that I've mentioned today, where did they go? Did any of the things that we've talked about that might occur, did they occur or did they not? And if they didn't, why not? And if they did, were we ready for it? So thanks for your attention. I've enjoyed discussing this with you. Have a great day.
So, General McLaughlin, thank you so much for that. We're fortunate to start off with General Alexander and then had a phenomenal panel in the middle. I personally have learned so much from this. It's just absolutely stunning how far and how fast the world of cyber has come. And where it's going to go, as General McLaughlin said, it'll be very interesting to watch that. Dr. Holbrook, thanks again for sponsoring this with the Air Force Association. It's been an incredible day. Casey, turn it over to you.
Thank you, General Gray, and thank you all for watching today. The part 3 of our Ukraine What's Next series focusing on cybersecurity. Again, I want to thank our partners, the Florida Center for Cybersecurity at the University of South Florida, the West Coast chapter of the Air Force Association of Florida, Global Interdependency Center, Security Management International, the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership at the University of South Florida, the University of South Florida Sarasota Manatee campus, and Research One at USF. Be sure to join us for Part 4, the diplomatic and humanitarian aspects, on May 24th. And again, our newly created Part 5, the hearts and minds, exploring the information and misinformation, on June 8th. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.